everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Real Life Sex Chat Show, where we like to shine lots of light on the myriad ways that we all have sovereignty to set up our intimate relationships in the ways in which make us feel fulfilled and happy, and oftentimes may be outside of the box of traditional norms. And that's what we like to do here. So we have another amazing guest today. I'm going to read you her very short bio, and we're going to get right into the good stuff. So Stephanie Kohler is a musician, a writer, and an intuitive who is the founder of Sidereal Alchemy. Yes, Sidereal Alchemy, a place for, this is the best, okay? A place for rebels, nonconformists, and weirdos to lean into the magic of who they already are. Stephanie, I love your bio. That is amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here today. How are you?
Thanks for having me.
Good. So Stephanie and I usually tell people, like, because sometimes I'm interviewing someone who I've actually never had a conversation with before. Stephanie and I have had a few conversations prior to this particular conversation. So I'm particularly interested and excited to share Stephanie's magic with you all today. So I think we're going to start kind of how we usually start, which is to talk about what was influencing you in your earlier years before you kind of knew what type of relationship and intimacy was good for you, and how did you get from where you were then to where you are now?
That's a great question. You don't need a whole lot when you start there. I think like a lot of people, if you're, like, I was raised in a fairly religious household, a Christian household, and not evangelical. I mean, especially now, I feel like that's a really important distinction to make. Religious in the sense of like going to church a lot and like being very involved in that community and being very enmeshed in a lot of those views. But I also grew up in a very diverse city, and I fortunately had adults around me and my parents who were very open to people who did not live exactly the way they lived. So it was an interesting mix. I think a lot of times now when we talk about religious backgrounds, because there are a lot of evangelical examples. That's not what I mean when I say that. But it still felt very heavy-handed for me as a child. Like, it was a lot of being told again and again and again that, like, my body is dirty, that I'm sinful, like who I am is sinful, that women, you know, it's the job of women not to tempt men and lead men into sin, like a lot of that rhetoric, right? And then also, I think growing up in the misogyny that fortunately now we're really starting to unpack, but like I definitely grew up with girls are not good at science, girls are not good at math, girls can't, you know, like that is what I was put into.
Clean, right, yep.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it wasn't quite cook and clean. Like my mom is a pretty intense feminist, so fortunately for me, I had like an alternative to that dialogue.
Thank God.
But in terms of like school and a lot of adults and, you know, that mentality was still very strong. So it was a weird dynamic because that was what I lived with growing up in the South. But I also have parents who are not from the South. And like I said, my mom is this very intense feminist. She's a first-generation American, basically. So she also has this whole dynamic of like moving a bit out of the culture she grew up in, and then kind of me also seeing that pattern replicated of having a dynamic at home in terms of how women and girls could behave and how they could speak out and be assertive, and then also being out in the world and being like, oh, but that's not okay out here, you know? So there was always this push-pull for me. And because I got exposed to people from different countries, people of different races, different sexualities, like whatever, there were also these weird moments for me where I was just like, well, why is it my responsibility not to tempt men? And like, why is my body so dirty? And like, why, you know,
question.
Like,
you
know, I was this like weirdo kid, and I got bullied a lot, so I was alone a lot.
To me, that's like super sane,
healthy,
super logical,
healthy.
Yeah,
yes,
healthy, exactly.
Right, but at the time, you know, so yeah, I had this very strange sort of thing to navigate in terms of what a lot of the like elders and adults in my life were telling me, but then sort of how the home dynamic would deviate from that, and then just my own I used to read, I still do, like I read tons of books. I was just curious about the world, and I was just like, this stuff doesn't, like, these things don't make sense.
No.
Something in here, like there are alternatives and people aren't talking about them, or like something's wrong. And it just didn't make sense for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, my experience of Christianity in that way is that it's very limiting about sexuality. Not to say you can't, I'm not trying to say you can't be Christian and can't be a healthy, like sexual being. But my experience, it was very limited, and, it was very heteronormative. It was very like monogamy normative. Is that a word? Whatever the word is.
I don't know what it is, but I like it. I like it.
You know what I mean?
Monogonormative.
Heteronormative and like monogamy normative.
Yeah.
And I was just like, God, that's really boring and, weird.
Yeah.
It doesn't, it just feels like it stifles a lot of people's expression.
Stifles. That's how I feel personally as well with monogamy. So I hear you.
Yeah. And so it's taken, that's what I feel like I've done in my life, is just navigate how do I show up authentically as me, and how do I find relationships that give me space to be myself, because I really see intimate relationships as a space for more freedom. And that's something that I had to get away from in like the upbringing. I got married a couple years ago, but it was really, I had a lot of resistance, partly because I really hate a lot of cultural descriptions of marriage. Like I hate the ball and chain, and I hate the making an honest man. I'm like, this is terrible. Like, why does anybody want to do this? Like, there's no joy. There's no freedom to me in that. Like, so it's very much for me been this journey of understanding how I define freedom, how I define intimacy, how I define embodiment.
Yeah.
And then how do I find that in how I relate to other people?
Yeah.
And,
go ahead.
And then the other piece, I think, well, the other piece that goes along with that is also, I feel like a lot of the very heteronormative, cis-normative, monogamy normative narratives were very much about intimacy is just a cis man and a cis woman in a marriage, right? And this sense of, I think there are loads of intimacies, like that aren't even physical necessarily, that are, right?
Actually, as far as I know, the definition of intimacy is just interrelatedness between two people.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily have to insinuate any sexuality whatsoever. It's just a familiarity, a deeper familiarity between two people.
Yeah. Like, I think you can have intimacy with your friends. I think you can have intimacy with people you work with.
Totally.
And I'm a musician. I've been a performer my whole life, basically. It's like there's artistic intimacy that you can have with people where it's super deep, it's super intense, it is super vulnerable, and it's not something that I necessarily share with people in general. It's really about these certain containers that happen. So I think part of my process has been understanding like how I get to define all these things for myself.
Yeah.
And so however I want to define intimacy, and then I think ultimately certain characteristics go across all the types of intimacy, right? Like a romantic intimacy versus like an artistic intimacy, right? Like there can be certain things that they have in common and certain things that are different.
Overlapping, sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, and I think I'm somebody who really loves variety. I'm really curious about the world. I've traveled a lot. I've lived overseas. So I just like seeing examples. Yeah. Not because I want to do all those things that I've witnessed or that they all really resonate. Like some of them I'm like, great, do your thing. Like not for me, right?
And I think, can I just say really quickly, because that is so powerful, that statement of embodiment and way of being, that we can both witness other folks doing and acting in ways that make them feel good, understand and accept that that doesn't feel good for us, and fully accept them and support them at the same time.
Right.
Like, what a novel concept.
We're excited, right?
Whoa, like, but how liberating is that? Like, I can't imagine living my life without that, right? Can you? I can't imagine what type of misery that must feel like, to feel like you have to see everyone else behaving in the way that you think is the only way that's okay to behave, and otherwise you are unhappy.
Yeah.
How much
And I think
power is that giving away? Like, it's just.
I totally agree. And I think the irony is really that that's how a lot of people define safety, right? It's like when I'm around people who are making the same life choices, whose lives look like mine, that's how I feel safe and grounded and like good about my decisions. But when you actually feel good and grounded in who you are, it doesn't matter who's around you, and it doesn't matter if there are alternatives, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's so powerful to like make these definitions for ourselves, make the choices that are in alignment with them, and like enjoy who you are and like enjoy witnessing other people being who they are. And like it doesn't matter at all if we agree, like do your thing, you know,
Absolutely.
and yeah, and for me, it's very expansive. Like it's this sense of creating a big giant space where everybody gets to like be who they are.
Right. Right.
So
and
yeah,
can I ask
but
a little bit about the resistance to the marriage? Because I
yes.
get that because of, I was just having this conversation. Well, I wasn't really, so I won't even get too into it, but somebody in an online space had said something about open marriages and ethical non-monogamy bastardizing marriage. So you can imagine, and I'm not a fighter. Like I don't go online. I actually don't. It was actually a very, it was in a place where the person who had posted the original post is a very conscious person, and and it even seemed like the person who had written that wasn't saying it in a way that they were trying to be attacky, but it's still, and I kind of just said, hey, you know, that doesn't necessarily feel great. I don't think that those of us who choose to make marriage whatever it means for us. She's like, well, why even get married in the first place? And I said, because I needed health insurance. That's why I got married. Legit. Straight up. Like, I love my husband.
Okay, great.
We've been together 15 years now, and luckily for both of us, we actually are in love and we actually do want to be together forever. But back then, we hadn't even known each other an entire year. It was just that I was in an industry back then that did not have health insurance, and he was in one that did, and I have a chronic disease. And so so that was how I got, and I wasn't super gung-ho about marriage. Even back then, I was like, I wasn't looking for my prince to come riding up to save me. Like I just never, that was never a narrative in my own life. But because he was, in a sense, giving me that thing that I needed, and he wanted to, and I wanted to, it was an alternative marriage right from the beginning. Even if we weren't ethically non-monogamous, we were getting married because I needed health insurance and I needed it fast. So how do you get past, you know, especially if you just got married a few years ago, you know, all of that marriage means that the man owns you. I mean, essentially that's what it was originally set up as. You need to take this name.
Property exchange.
Become one entity.
Power dynamics.
And I own you now. And now you, the woman, back then, you can't own property. You can't have your own business. You can't, everything is the man's to take care of. So how do you, knowing that, you know, get past that in your own life?
Yeah, it's a thing. And I can tell you that we had a very unromantic proposal moment because he proposed and I was like, really? And he goes, yeah, because we talked about it. Like it wasn't out of nowhere.
Right.
And I was like, oh, we need to like hash this out for a while. Like maybe, you know, and it wasn't about a commitment piece. It was about whether or not I really wanted to be engaged in the institution of marriage. Right. Because like that comment that you said that someone made, like, that's so weird because it's so ignorant of the history of marriage. Because like you said, it's like it used, like primarily for so many people was property exchange and power dynamics. And I especially when you're talking about,
this woman was a women's empowerment coach that I didn't know. Oof, and that's when I went to her page and I was like, sending blessings to her and all of her clients because damn. But anyway, sorry.
Yeah. I mean, no worries. But yeah, it's a heavy statement. And to me, yeah, it's very ignorant of what the history of marriage is. And like, yeah, I mean, I was reluctant to enter into that energetic. I mean, I really believe in energetics of all those spaces, right? That part of what I'm doing in my marriage is defining this space and this institution in a way that suits me, that's right for my relationship. But just like, do I want to be a wife? Like, that's a whole like loaded cultural thing that like, I don't know if I want that, you know, like there's some nasty stuff in history with that. And I also think about, you know, I do a lot of energetic work and I do a lot of ancestral work. And so I think about I am the first woman in my family who didn't have to get married, who didn't feel like she couldn't have a life unless she had a husband.
Right.
And I was like, do I want to get, like, is getting married going to mean that I'm caving to that? Right. Mm-hmm. Like there was this piece where I was just like, I don't know, like maybe I want to be the first woman that doesn't get married because I don't have to. I can have a bank account. I can run a business. I can get a job. I can do whatever I want. And I do not have to have a husband to be a functional adult in the world. Mm-hmm. So there was a ton of resistance. You know, it's just like, I don't know if that's really where I want to show up or how I want to show up and engage in that way energetically. So there was also the health insurance piece, which is totally fucking real. Like,
no, you can say fuck.
Sorry. I get heated about these things. Yeah, so the health insurance. That's one of the reasons
I love you, because we're both very passionate about these things, and we're not afraid to say so, because that's also really rare nowadays. So, yeah.
Yeah. So the health insurance piece was a real thing too, and we had a whole piece of getting married, like personally, spiritually, mm-hmm. and then we had government marriage, and they were different rituals. Like our what I think of as our marriage ritual, like our ceremony that we created and had all of our loved ones in, was not legally binding, and that was very deliberate, because I was like, this isn't for the government, like this is for us. And the government thing is for a bunch of government things that I'm agreeing to, like these terms and conditions, basically, is what it kind of feels like. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I had a huge resistance to all those things, and also kind of going back to like the messaging that I grew up with. You know, I was in so many situations where if girls said like, I want to live in a big house or I want to do this, like we always got told to marry a doctor, right? Yeah. And then got told to be a doctor, right? So there was also that messaging that I grew up with in my life of like, oh God, like what does this mean for me? You know, like I really needed time to decide what this was going to mean for me in my life, because I felt like if I just sort of stepped into it because like, yeah, it's the thing, it's available, and that's like the natural next step, like that felt super gross. Mm-hmm. And I'm just a very intentional person, you know. I really there are reasons behind like 99.9% of what I do. Not to say I'm not spontaneous, but
I understand.
But I don't just sort of like randomly make gigantic decisions on the fly.
Yeah. But it sounds like the way you decided about your marriage was, one of my favorite words was, in a sovereign state. You said, I am aware of all of the terms and conditions that marriage enters me into, and I'm also aware of how I feel about it, and that now that I'm in this place of awareness and understanding, I can make this decision from a place that's for me, and then you don't have to say it's because I need to fit into this box, you know, this predestined box that women need to aspire to be worthy or valuable.
Totally.
Human beings. So yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've encountered this or not, but like as a cis woman married to a cis man, I think outwardly a lot of people could look at that and just be like, oh, well, that's just people doing what they feel like they have to, and they're following the flow chart. And for me, and it seems like for you too, it's like I gave myself every option. Like I've never told myself like you're not allowed to date whoever, you're not allowed to be attracted, like it's sinful or evil to be attracted to certain people. Like, no. So I came into all of this in a place of freedom, you know, and this is what I chose, but it's not because I limited the menu, right? Like I had the whole buffet out in front of me.
I love that. I absolutely love that. Yes.
Yeah.
So I would love to hear you speak more about Sidereal Alchemy. I'll one day be able to say that. I love it.
You're good. You're doing a great job.
Thank you. But for me, is the place for rebels, nonconformists, and weirdos to lean into the magic of who they already are. Because just that statement right there says so much about you, about what you believe and what you know in this world. So can you talk a little bit more about that aspect of yourself and how that influences you being in relationship with other people?
Sure. Yeah. It's a big topic. So just feel free to like nudge me places if you feel like there's...
Dial it in a little bit more. Like, so you identify the people that you're calling in for them in a sense by calling out nonconformists rebels, and weirdos, like which I love because I consider myself to be all of those things. And actually, I was just interviewing another amazing human being prior to speaking to you. And I was saying how I actually very much identify with the word freak. Like that's a word that
totally.
I enjoy the word freak. Like somebody might say it as an insult, but I'm like, no.
It's delicious. It's a delicious word.
So
it's a noun, it's a verb, it's an adjective. Like it's great.
Get your freak on. Yes, like so many different things. So in that sense, calling in folks that identify as that, what is your, I guess, why is that important for you? I think might be a better question.
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, that's very much how I felt my whole life. You know, like what I was saying, as far as I very much grew up in this environment where there was the home dynamic and the home sort of cultural mores, and then there was the outside world and sort of having to be a bit of a shapeshifter. And just, I was this weirdo kid who wasn't into TV and video games when they were like coming out, and it was like such a big thing, and I wanted to read books and play in the woods. So yeah, I feel like I've always been out of step in some way. So it's very much a personal thing in the sense of like wanting to create a container with people who understand who I am, right? It's like if you are coming for like templates and like Instagram influencer kind of vibe, like I just, that's not what I do. Like, not dogging it if that's what you like, but it's just not what I do. So making it clear, you know, what the container is and what I embody. And also because I feel like that's, you know, like it makes sense that those are people who I think vibe with me the most.
Yeah.
And whose experience that I can speak to, you know, as far as I think a lot of people end up reaching adulthood realizing like, oh, wow, there are a lot of things that I sort of accepted or I was conditioned to that aren't authentic to me. And I think there's so much pressure, you know, especially in puberty, but really to your whole childhood of like fitting in and like behaving and like not getting shunned if you do the wrong thing. And so I very much lived a life where I was constantly screwing that up. Like I basically followed the rules enough not to get into a ton of trouble.
Yeah.
And then I was just kind of like, fuck off for the rest of it. I was
like
very abrasive.
Similar to you in that sense.
Yeah. I was very abrasive. And now I'm just grateful because I feel like adulthood for me is actually a lot more joyful because I have the space to really show up as I want to, create the spaces I want to be with, be in relationship with the people I want to be with, as opposed to you guys are my classmates and those are the only options, right? Yeah, I'm just here and this is the only thing I get to do. And yeah, I'm grateful for like the variety that we all get to experience in the world now. And yeah, and I feel like that's what I can speak to. I really, for people who, you know, I think there are a lot of people who come out of very, I don't know how to describe it best, maybe kind of controlling circumstances, and then like kind of as adults have this whole real intense like phase of just like figuring it out. And I think that I can speak to that for people who really do identify as like nonconformists and weirdos, but also I've never had that experience because I've been like this my whole life.
Yeah.
So it ends up, what's interesting for me, the way I see it coming up in my work oftentimes is, especially in one-on-one sessions, like when people talk about their childhoods or they talk about kind of the old self, right? Like when they were sort of trapped in sort of mainstream thinking, it's often very easy for me to pick out moments where it's like, but really, you know, and it's stuff that they've known like and recollected about themselves the whole time, but they haven't recognized it. Yeah. And it's often very easy for me to pick up on it because it's like this is just who I've been the whole time.
It's a mirror. Yeah, it's a mirror.
Yeah, very much. Yeah, very much so.
What you said about, I really identified with the kind of like being an adult is so much more freeing. Oftentimes I'll hear people saying like, oh, I wish I could go back to being X amount of age, or I'm like, I would not go back anywhere. Like for any amount of money, I want to be here now in this body, in this version of myself, because just like you, I feel much freer and more awake and more conscious and more capable for pretty much every aspect of my life now. And I think that kind of is a good lead in, because I think it's very much about embodiment, because we had talked about this and being in your body. Because now at this age, I'm 39 years old, I feel much more myself than I ever have. And I feel like as I get older, I feel more and more like myself, more and more comfortable in the skin that I'm in and more accepting of every bit of it. So let's talk a little bit about embodiment, because I know as an intuitive, we're both intuitives, really getting into your own body. And especially when it comes to intimacy, especially sexual intimacy, loving and being comfortable and accepting of your own body is crucial. Like, it's absolutely necessary, because if you don't love your body, even if the person that you're with is verbalizing and physically letting you know that they love your body, there's still going to be this massive brick wall.
Totally.
Of like, well, how could you possibly? This is disgusting. And there, all of these. So what advice do you have for people who are really just maybe getting into the idea of embodying their awesomeness? I mean, their wholeness, their divinity, their all of these things that are there for us, but through societal conditioning and upbringing, they can be very heavily veiled, or even like really see that they're there. So how do you begin breaking down those walls?
There's so much. I mean, I think the first thing, really, even before you get into how you get embodied, is recognizing that our culture is very disembodied. Right? Like just giving yourself like some grace on, like, we've come to this in a very honest, innocent way, right? I think I used to think that it was more in women than men, or because of like patriarchy, but I really think everybody gets disembodied.
As indoctrinated as we are.
Yeah, everybody gets disembodied with like cis het patriarchy, and maybe in different ways and in different messaging. So I think the first piece is just kind of recognizing that if you're in that space of feeling like, wow, I'm really out of my body, I'm really disconnected, that like that's actually pretty normal. And it takes work to get, for most people, in my experience, in my observation over the years, it takes work to really get into the body, that most of us are not naturally there as we've grown up in this culture, right? We're very like emotionally unexpressive in our culture oftentimes. So first piece is just like, there are a lot of reasons why that could have happened. And then if you layer in things like abuse or assault or like trauma, like all of those things, right? So that's often where I start, is just kind of how did you get pulled away, and just honoring that for what it is. And like, you've survived it, you lived through it, and like be appreciative. Like don't beat yourself up if you feel like you're out of your body, because most of us have been.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like a disconnect.
Totally.
That's like one of the things that and not to get too astrological, but being a Scorpio moon, the moon being in my first house, of the house of the body, I'm very embodied. And I always have been, although I didn't have the terminology to identify what was happening. But even as a young person, very sexual, very, even though I had an unfortunately negative relationship with my body until I got into my 20s, I still knew that it was super powerful. And that even if it wasn't what I desired for it to be looking like or feeling like, I was aware that I held an incredible amount of power in my body.
Absolutely.
And that I could use it, I could wield it, for lack of a better term. But I think there are a lot of folks in the world, even now, even adults, that don't see their bodies as this powerful, miraculous vessel of creative expression. Maybe a good question is like, for somebody that might be there, do you have any practices or things that you might recommend for people who say, oh my gosh, I kind of relate to what they're saying, but right now my body just doesn't even, it feels like a weak, listless, like a lot of people do feel. How do we begin to close that gap?
Yeah, I mean, I love that framing of it, because I agree with you. I had very similar experience as a child of having all kinds of sexual energies at a very young age, and I got ace at hiding it, because I was like, I'm going to get in trouble. Like, I got to find a way sort of give myself some space when it's available, but like I got to go be normal when I go to school, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So that resonates. But yeah, I mean, to me, the most like available way to look at it is that every moment is a possibility to be in your body. And every small little thing you do is a way to be in your body. Like, for example, right before you hit record, I like put on perfume. Guess what? Hello, the only person smelling it is me.
And pants.
And and pants. That was also the other thing.
Pants
also for me.
Yeah, I like that.
The essentials. The non-essentials as far as what you can see on the screen. But, you know, this sense of like, there's that moment of pleasure, and that's just for me. Like, that's just me being in my body. Like, I can smell it. I like it. I'm having a great time.
I love
and
that.
It's not because I have to rationalize why it makes sense, even though no one can smell it but me. And I don't have to make it be for someone else, which I think is so often how, at least, I mean, I can only really speak to the experience of women and girls, but like how often women and girls are not allowed to be in their bodies or feel pleasure unless it's for someone else benefiting, right? And so this opportunity of like any moment, you alone putting on a sweatshirt that's really cozy and comfortable is an opportunity to just be in your body and savor that experience, right?
Yes. That is powerful. And I just even want to say, because you just made me think of something that I do, and I never really thought of it as an embodiment thing. And what I tell my husband about it is like, when I'm washing the blankets, like the bed sheets, like, and it's cold out, like as soon as the blanket comes out of the dryer, I just wrap myself in it and I sit down on the floor of the dryer, and I'm just like, oh, this feels so good. Nobody's around. My cat's looking at me like, can I get in there? Like, but like, it's for me because it feels good in my body to just be like wrapped in that warmth. And
totally,
that's enough. Like, there doesn't need to be another reason. No one else, it's not for anyone else. And I think that is I never really made that distinction, but to be embodied is to be enjoying your body for the sake of enjoying your own body for no one else. Like, that's big.
And like I said, to me, just even recognizing that you've had maybe a history of being out of the body, and just recognizing like, okay, but I'm here and I see that now. Like, that is a step back into the body, you know, and that's you becoming more available to your own experience. But yeah, like, I mean, when you're like, if you go out and get the mail out of the mailbox and you stop for 10 seconds and just look at the sky and you're like, wow, it's a really nice time to go out and get the mail, right? Like, every moment is just this way to tap into that. And it doesn't have to be this profound, you know, like, it doesn't have to involve like candles and crystals, like in the world that I'm in, like kind of woo spaces, right? It doesn't have to be like candles and crystals and aromatherapy, right? It could. That's great. But also like any little moment, savoring a meal without your phone, you know, like any little moment is a way to tap in.
That's interesting the way that you frame that, because although I know it and it makes total sense, but really embodiment is presence.
Yeah.
At the very core of it is that
that's how I think of it.
That is amazing. And it's a really good distinction. It makes it much clearer, I think, at least for me, when I think about it, like, what is embodiment? It's being present in the moment with no expectations other than I'm here, I am with myself right now. And there's no productivity that needs or end result that needs to be met. It's just being. And one of the things I always teach about presence is that the second you realize you're not present, you're present.
Right.
That's it. Like,
there it is.
Like, there it is. Oh, I'm out of my mind. I'm out of my body right now. Oh, as soon as I recognize that, I'm here. I'm back.
You're back.
Like you said, you don't have to have a candle burning or have Palo Santo burning, but you can, and that's wonderful. Right. However, that's not required. And I think that's powerful.
Yeah. Another big piece for me around getting back into my body was defining pleasure in a different way than I'd been told, because I think so often pleasure broadly gets conflated with sexual pleasure, often like cis hetero sexual pleasure, right? And this idea that pleasure it could be anything. Like, it goes back to intimacy, right? Like, it isn't just about a sexual like situation or a sexual dynamic. Pleasure is just anything can be pleasurable. Food is pleasurable. That blanket you pulled out of the dryer is pleasurable. Like, that perfume I put on is really pleasurable. Like, this, again, like, so many things become available, so many moments become available because there are so many opportunities to tap into pleasure.
Yeah.
And I think for me, especially as a woman growing up in the culture that we live in, and as someone who's been assaulted and who's been raped, it's like reclaiming what pleasure is and making that mine, and not making it something that depends on someone else's definition or other people's understanding of it, has been really helpful to bring me back into my body. And not to say that is exactly how it suits everybody else, but for me, it was a big piece.
Also really important, and one of the things I'm doing in my program right now is I have embodiment practices, and one of them is called prioritizing pleasure. And it's interesting, I never really thought about it, but also might need some, this might be informing what I'm going to talk about even in my own program, about defining pleasure, right? Redefining pleasure. Because I gave a whole list. I said it could look like you just get an entire pint of raspberries and you eat it all yourself, and you don't do it, and you turn your phone off. Like that, to me, like that sounds just like really pleasurable, right? There's it's nothing inherently sexual about it. It's just fun and joyful, and there's no expectation of it. And I think that that's really important too, especially for folks who have been through sexual trauma. That is something that that's easy, a very easy way to get disembodied, because you've then experienced something that informs your mind that your body is not valuable, right? I mean, I have unfortunately, I would say unfortunately, the majority of women, now that I'm really thinking about it,
I think so.
Assaulted. And so that's horrifying, and also reality, which is, and
I mean, it is
both end. So
right, absolutely.
And so since you did say so, I mean, for women who have been through something like that, how did you begin to unpack the trauma and separate that away from your ability to identify with your own definition of pleasure?
That's an interesting, I haven't quite framed it like that, so that's an interesting, I appreciate that, the way you phrased that. For me, it was being active, in the sense of like it was when one of the ways that I really started to be able to process my own trauma was asana practice. Because it was structured, and I had to do things that were like strange or uncomfortable or difficult. But I was fortunate to have really wonderful, experienced teachers who really held this container of, it wasn't judgy, and it wasn't about being flashy. It was just really about like being with yourself, and this practice, like asana practice, was this tool of being present.
And I was going to say, for folks who don't know what an asana practice is, can you just give a little bit more on what that is?
A lot of people call it a yoga practice, and basically asana is being a little bit more specific. That yoga, broadly speaking, can encompass a lot of different practices like breath work or meditation, but asana practice is specifically the postural
body
practice.
Poses, right? Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, like sun salutations and things you've probably seen out in the world.
Absolutely.
And then also so doing things like that were very active, like dance classes, like playing instruments, because I'm a musician, right? Like things that made me get into my body in a very intentional way. And then also not being so active, like meditation was a big way for me to see how out of body I was, and how quickly I wanted to get out of my body if I wasn't doing something interesting,
Meditation will tell you that right away.
Meditation is just like so fast.
Yes.
But also this capacity of being still, because I think also sometimes the sort of trauma response, and I'm not a therapist, so I don't want to be reckless with throwing these terms around, but as I understand it, the sort of like constant activity and constant sort of stimulation and constant doing, which was very much my life for like decades, was very much this way of not processing my traumatic experiences, right? I'm always doing, I never have to sit down with myself and be with my feelings because I'm too busy all the time, right? So for me, it's a both and, right? It's like doing stuff that gets me in my body, that I have to think about it and pay attention and be really intentional, and then also being my body where there's like nothing happening, and that still can be intentional and thoughtful, and So I think both, for me, both, like all of it, all of these pieces.
Absolutely.
Those things are all. And then just like, if you really want to zoom out to like just life fundamentals, like giving myself permission to eat well and to get enough sleep and to not do emotional labor for every single person that demands it, and to wear whatever clothes I want to wear, like just like the most basic decisions. Like, again, everything is an opportunity, right? It's like how, when I really started to think about all the ways I did not give myself permission to be myself and I was not accepting who I was, it was literally down to like my toothbrush, you know, like it was just every fucking thing.
Yeah. Yeah. But choosing, but making that decision to choose those things deliberately for yourself based on what yourself desired versus like what anybody else or any other person or any other societal construct says is the right way. You just said, I see that and I am doing this because this is what. And also understanding too, for people out there, it doesn't just, you know, being a rebel or a nonconformist, it doesn't mean that you're not going to like some of the things that society has set up for us. It doesn't, again, it's just all both and. It's like sometimes even a person who is a nonconformist is going to like, you know, I don't know. I can't even think of anything right off the top of my head that's society.
Well, like when we were talking about how we're both married to men.
Right.
Like,
exactly.
That looks very like mainstream and boring, right? Like,
I like being married to my husband and I like also having sex with other people. and I get to have both. And I think that's really important. And I think that's a big distinction. It's like you, whoever you are, you get to have whatever you want if and when you're willing to honor whatever it is and not judge critically or harshly whatever that might be, because that thing is not in alignment with, that thing is maybe bastardizing the traditional norms of marriage, but that doesn't mean that it's wrong.
That's all right. Yeah. Well, it's like, again, it's like not being a rebel or a nonconformist out of principle, like, oh, this is how everybody does it, so I won't.
Right. It's
like, again, like what we've been saying, like choosing it intentionally. Like you have all of these options, you have all these possibilities, and recognizing like this is what I'm choosing. This is what's in alignment with who I am. And then I feel like the person I am and the work that I do in the world, I'd feel incomplete if I didn't mention, like, for me, a big piece was also defining and creating a relationship to the sacred that honors who I am. That's not the religion I grew up with, right? And not to disparage that for people who feel in alignment with it. But it wasn't for me. It never was. It was never the right fit. And just, like, and it is always evolving, you know, in terms of like the rituals that I do or ways that feel appropriate to kind of process whatever I'm going through, or how I want to communicate with my ancestors or whatever, right? It's like that is always changing because I'm a person who's changing.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's that same idea of like giving yourself permission and choosing the definitions, right? Not just saying, well, you know, if I'm not going to do this organized religion thing in this way, then the other way to do it is this, and I have to adhere to someone else's template or someone else's
It's either
flowchart,
religion or it's atheism. It's like those are both options, and there are 1,000 more options in the in-between there that you do get to define. And can you just for a second, because the word sacred, so when I was as creating my course, Sacred Sexual Energy Experience, the challenge for me is that, and again, I don't mean this in a negative way, but generally speaking, religion has co-opted the words like sacred and holy, and these words that are actually very deeply meaningful to me, but have absolutely nothing to do with organized religion. Can you talk about sacred? You know, because you said creating the sacred space. In
the sense of how I define it, or?
And how you define it and how you live it in your own life and work.
You are like ace with the questions, like go. I love it.
No, but you don't have to
I love it.
I mean, I just
it's good. You're good.
I love these conversations, and it's just so, for me, it's just so fulfilling to have these conversations with other people who understand what I'm talking about and have their own opinions and experiences on it. So.
For sure. I think for me, as I define the sacred, it's really just being aware of what's around me, you know, that for me, like the nature is the most sacred thing. really, in the sense of what it teaches me, the way I am nourished by it, the way that I am participating in it, that I'm a part of it. And so in the sense of what is like the holiest, most divine presence, like one of them for sure is just what the world we're in, you know, the plants and the animals and the bacteria and all the things, right? It's this wondrous.
I'm just sitting here with rocks all the time.
Like, yeah, exactly.
Yep.
It's this wondrous thing that's beyond anything anybody can create, right? Like any human can create. Yeah. And then I think when I think of kind of sacred in like the energetic kind of non-physical sense, right? I feel like for me, it's tapping into a much bigger consciousness that's beyond an individual, right? And it's tapping into integrity that isn't necessarily comfortable all the time. You know, for me, like integrity by definition means it's hard. Like doing the right thing is hard, and like being conscious and being kind and being compassionate is often not what my ego wants. So this sense of like, if it's always easy, then I'm maybe not fully tapped in. So yeah, this capacity and this awareness, and then my capacity to connect to it, right? And when I think about kind of like right now, this time of year, like around like Samhain and people who celebrate Dia de los Muertos and things like that, like thinking about people's spiritual gifts and kind of what we tap into and like ancestral patterns and all that stuff, like just whatever you define, like again, you get to define what sacred is, right? And for some people, like if they have children, that's part of their sacred, right? I mean, I believe children are sacred. I just happen not to have like my own. You know, people's work in the world or just whatever it is, but like this recognition of, you know, there are all of these things that are bigger than who we are, that are beyond our definition, that are beyond our measurement, that are beyond like quantification. And so like, how do you experience that? How do you sort of describe it? Because it's indescribable. And how do you witness it, and how do you connect to it?
Yeah, I love that. I love that so much. It's really, and again, you speak and then I get like different things that come to my mind, but it's really just the ways in which it's connected to the collective wholeness of everything and the expansiveness beyond anything that our human mind can comprehend. And that in and of itself is sacred when you when you honor it in such a way, and when you interact with the world around you in that thought, I guess, or that embodiment. It's really a holistic view. It's not just your mind or your body or your spirit. It's everything, and it's how that's all connected together. Yeah, no, that's good.
So I was telling you right before we started how I'm all into like language magic and words, and that's how Sidereal Alchemy, the name, came out. But one of my favorite little like pieces like that is integrity. The word comes from the same root as integer. And an integer is like a whole number, like a sense of wholeness, right? Right. I mean, like, let's not get too crazy because I have an English degree, so like we're not going to go too far with that. But this sense of like integrity to me is a sense of wholeness and a sense of unity. And that means if I'm really tapping into the collective and I'm thinking about collective well-being and collective joy and embodiment and love, like then, you know, sometimes that's hard, right? And it's not just about like what's fun for me and what's easy, but this sense of what the sacred is and where it can bring us is like tapping us into that capacity for unity and for wholeness. Yeah. You know what I mean?
I do know what you mean. So yeah, I could keep asking you many, many questions and keep going here, but for the sake of, you know, folks' time, and I'm sure people probably still have questions about this, but I mean, really, do you, is there anything that you would like to speak on just to kind of like, you know, you've dropped a lot of wisdom and experiential knowledge on people today, but is there any other thing that you would like to highlight or kind of bring to the light during this conversation?
It's hard to pick one thing.
It's okay.
But I think something that I think is important that people don't always do, like I didn't always do, and also that's something that's very like central in how I work with people, because I'm not prescriptive and I'm not here to give people like templates and flowcharts and follow my method kind of person, is that it's important to trust who you are. And to like see yourself as this embodiment of the sacred, right? And if you don't, like what we've talked about, like, because there was definitely a time in my life when I did not, it's all right, you know, but also trust that that is who you are, I think, innately, all of us. And so there is that possibility to tap into that more deeply if you choose to go there, right? And to believe in that about yourself, as opposed to, I think, especially for people who get out of their bodies, like it's very easy to just think the worst of yourself and be hypercritical and just think, you know, it's hopeless, or I can't live the way I want to live, or I can't find joy or happiness the way I see other people doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. So. I love it. Yes, get embodied. And as easy as it, and as I was going to say, as simple as it is, it's not always easy, but it is always worth it, I think, at the end of the experience, whatever that might be. And whether, you know what, for anyone else out there, like that might be watching this, like, I don't believe in anything. I don't believe that we're, you know, divine or anything like that. Just wrap yourself in the blanket outside of the dryer.
Yes.
Like, if nothing else, you know.
I love that.
Of pleasure throughout your day. Well, I can't thank you enough. Every conversation I have with you, Stephanie, is expansive, and I appreciate that, like, more than I can express. So thank you for that. I hope everybody out there watching gained a little bit of knowledge, a little bit of maybe further interest in appreciating and embodying their own truth, whatever that might be for them, regardless of what society is telling them it needs to be. And yeah, for everyone out there, hope you enjoyed this, and you'll stay tuned for the next episode of Real Life Sex. And thank you so much, Stephanie, for joining today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Y'all take care out there.